In 2020, China released millions of fish into a dying river, and nobody expected what happened next. The Yangtze, the third longest river on Earth, was collapsing, and with it, the lifeline of 400 million people. That's more people than the entire population of the United States, depending on a single river that was running out of life. You heard that right. 400 million lives hanging on a body of water that scientists said was past the point of saving. But what China did next didn't just save the river, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about how nature heals. And to understand why what happened was so shocking, you first need to understand what the Yangtze used to be. The river that fed an empire. If you could step back 1,000 years and stand on the banks of the Yangtze, you wouldn't recognize it. Not because the landscape has changed, but because the water itself was alive in a way that's almost impossible to imagine today. This was a river that stretched nearly 4,000 miles from the glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau all the way to the East China Sea, and every mile of it was teeming with life. Over 400 species of freshwater fish called this single river basin home. More than half of them were found nowhere else on Earth. You're not talking about a river, you're talking about one of the most biologically rich freshwater ecosystems the planet has ever produced. And the creatures it held were unlike anything in any other waterway. The Chinese paddlefish, sometimes called the panda of the Yangtze, was a living fossil that had been swimming those waters for 200 million years. It survived the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. It could grow up to 23 feet long, nearly the length of a school bus, and it hunted using an electric-sensing sword-shaped snout that let it track prey through water so murky you couldn't see your own hand. Then there was the Yangtze Finless porpoise, the only freshwater porpoise left in Asia with a face that looked like it was permanently smiling, and an intelligence that had fascinated Chinese poets for centuries. And the Chinese sturgeon, an ancient, armored giant that migrated thousands of miles upriver to spawn in the exact same waters its ancestors had used since before human civilization existed. But the Yangtze wasn't just a biological marvel. It was the economic engine of an entire nation. It watered the rice paddies that fed hundreds of millions. It powered trade routes that built dynasties. For the communities that lived along its banks, the river wasn't a resource, it was a family member. Generations of fishermen passed their boats down like heirlooms. The river gave, and the people received, and for centuries, that relationship held. But what happens when you take more than a river can give? What happens when 400 million people start treating an ecosystem like it's infinite, and it isn't? That's exactly what happened next. Death by 1,000 cuts. The destruction of the Yangtze didn't happen overnight. It happened so slowly that by the time anyone sounded the alarm, the damage was already catastrophic. And it started with something that seemed harmless fishing. You have to understand the scale. At its peak, over 231,000 fishermen worked the Yangtze, operating more than 111,000 boats. In 1954, they pulled 427,000 tons of fish out of that river in a single year. The nets never stopped. The boats never rested. And the river, quietly, invisibly, started running out. By the 2000s, annual catches had collapsed to less than 100,000 tons. That's an 85% drop. The fishermen were hauling in less and less every year, and their solution was to fish harder, more boats, finer nets, longer hours. They weren't feeding their families anymore. They were draining the last blood from a river that was already on life support. But overfishing was only the first wound. Then came the dams. Over 50,000 of them. You heard that right. 50,000 dams and reservoirs were built across the Yangtze Basin, starting in the 1950s, including the largest hydroelectric dam ever constructed by human hands, the Three Gorges Dam, completed in 2003. Every single one of those dams did the same thing. It severed the river. Migration routes that fish had followed for millions of years were blocked overnight. Spawning grounds that species depended on were flooded, dried out, or buried under concrete. The river didn't just shrink, it was cut into pieces, and the creatures inside it were trapped in fragments of what used to be a connected world. And then came the poison. Thousands of chemical plants lined the Yangtze's banks, dumping untreated industrial waste directly into the water. Agricultural runoff carried pesticides and heavy metals downstream. Raw sewage from cities housing tens of millions of people flowed straight into the current. There were stretches of the Yangtze that turned colors no river should ever turn. Now here's what all of that cost. The Baiji, the Yangtze River dolphin, one of only 4 freshwater dolphin species on Earth, was declared functionally extinct, gone. An entire species of dolphin, erased from existence by the river that was supposed to protect it. The Chinese paddlefish, the creature that survived the dinosaurs for 200 million years, was declared extinct in 2020. The last one anyone ever saw alive was in 2003. The Finless porpoise population crashed from thousands to roughly 1,000, and the Chinese sturgeon, the ancient giant, simply stopped reproducing. No spawning activity was recorded after the year 2000. Not once. For 20 years. Silence. 70 years of destruction. 135 species gone from survey records. And scientists were now warning that the Yangtze was approaching something no one wanted to say out loud, the point of no return. But what happened next is something no one saw coming. The point of no return. By the late 2010s, the science was no longer a warning, it was a death certificate. Research teams from the Chinese Academy of Sciences were publishing papers saying what no government official wanted to hear. The Yangtze River was on the verge of total ecological collapse. Not declining, not struggling, collapsing. The kind of collapse you don't come back from. And the numbers backed it up. The river that once produced over 60% of China's entire freshwater fishery output now accounted for less than 1/3 of 1%. You could barely measure what it contributed anymore. Fish stocks that had sustained entire civilizations for millennia had plummeted by 85%. The river wasn't feeding anyone anymore. It was gasping. Scientists weren't issuing warnings, they were writing eulogies. Formal assessments now described the entire aquatic ecosystem as being on the verge of irreversible biological collapse. And then the paddlefish was confirmed. Gone. The creature that had already survived everything this planet could throw at it couldn't survive us. That was the final symbolic blow. And that's the moment the conversation changed. Here's what made this decision so difficult. The Yangtze River basin generates roughly 40% of China's entire economic output. Shutting down commercial fishing on a river that runs through 11 provinces and touches nearly every major industrial corridor in the country isn't a conservation policy, it's an economic earthquake. And every incremental measure they'd already tried had failed. Seasonal fishing bans had been in place since 2002. They didn't work. Fishermen simply fished harder the moment the bans lifted what scientists called retaliatory fishing. Restricted zones, hatchery programs, partial closures, none of it slowed the decline. The river kept dying, and the half measures kept failing. So the Chinese government was left with 2 choices. Protect the economy and watch the river cross the point of no return, or do something so extreme that no nation in history had ever attempted it at this scale. They chose the second option, and what they did next changed everything. The nuclear option. What China did next wasn't a policy adjustment. It wasn't a compromise. It was the most radical act of environmental intervention any government has ever attempted on a single river system, and the scientific community had a name for it. They called it the nuclear option. On January 1st, 2021, China enacted a complete commercial fishing ban across the entire Yangtze River basin. Not a seasonal pause, not a regional restriction. A total, blanket, 10-year ban, the longest and largest fishing moratorium in recorded human history. Every net was pulled from the water. Every line was cut. Every hook was removed. And an entire way of life that had existed along those banks for centuries was ordered to stop. But the ban was just the beginning. 231,000 fishermen, 250,000 human beings whose families had worked the river for generations, were told their livelihoods were over. Not next year, not gradually. Now, the Chinese government committed $2.7 billion to retrain, relocate, and compensate them. Entire fishing villages were emptied. Communities that had defined themselves by the river for hundreds of years had to find a new identity overnight. You're not just talking about an I-team. Economic policy. Here you're talking about the erasure of a culture. Then came the boats. 111,000 fishing vessels were impounded, decommissioned, or physically destroyed, pulled from the water, stripped down, and removed from the river permanently. The Yangtze, for the first time in modern memory, fell silent. But China still wasn't done. They turned on the infrastructure itself. 300 dams were demolished along the Qishui River, a critical tributary of the upper Yangtze, and over 340 small hydropower stations were shut down. These weren't cosmetic removals. These were full-scale demolitions designed to reconnect migration corridors that had been severed for decades, to restore natural water flow, and to reopen spawning grounds that entire species depended on. Across the broader basin, more than 9,000 chemical enterprises were shut down, relocated, or forced to overhaul their operations. The law banned the construction or expansion of any chemical plant within half a mile of the riverbank. The poison pipeline was being dismantled, piece by piece. And then came the final act, the one that gave this story its name. China began releasing millions of hatchery-bred fish back into the Yangtze. Over 5 million Chinese sturgeons alone had been bred in captivity and poured into the river across the span of the program, including over 1 million in a single year. These were fish returning to waters that hadn't seen their kind in decades. Ancient species, reintroduced into a river that had forgotten what they looked like. No nation had ever attempted anything like this. And when the world watched it happen, the reaction was split down the middle. Half the scientific community called it visionary, and the other half called it a gamble that was almost certainly too late. Then came the results. The silence. After the ban took effect, the Yangtze entered a kind of limbo that nobody knew how to read. The nets were gone. The boats were gone. The fishermen were gone. And for the first time in 70 years, the river was left completely alone. But that didn't mean it was healing. You have to understand, the scientists who supported this ban were not optimistic. They were desperate. There's a difference. The Yangtze had been degraded for 7 straight decades. Its food chains had been shattered. Its migration routes had been blocked. Its water had been poisoned. Some ecologists warned publicly that the damage was already irreversible, that the river had crossed a biological threshold from which no ecosystem recovers, no matter how much time you give it. The models said that even under the best-case scenario, meaningful recovery would take generations, not years. Not decades, generations. So what followed was a period of extraordinary tension. Monitoring teams deployed sonar equipment, underwater cameras, and sampling stations across 57 sections of the river. Government officials who had staked billions of dollars and their political reputations on this decision waited for data that might never come. And the fishermen, the ones who had surrendered their boats, their nets, and their identities, watched from the banks of a river they were no longer allowed to touch, wondering if any of it would matter. A nation had bet everything on a single hope that a dying river still remembered how to live. What happened next stunned every single one of them. What nobody expected. The first results came in within 2 years, and they didn't just surprise the scientists, they broke the models. An international research team assessed fish communities across 57 sections of the Yangtze, comparing data from before the ban to data collected after it took effect. What they found was so dramatic that when the study was published in the journal Science, it sent shockwaves through the global conservation community. Fish biomass in the Yangtze had increased by 209%. Not 20, not 50, 209. The river hadn't just stabilized, it had exploded with life at a pace that no predictive model had even considered possible. Species richness climbed by 13%, and for a river that had been losing species every single year for 70 years straight, that number wasn't just a statistic. It was a reversal of what scientists believed was a one-way trajectory toward collapse. But the biomass surge was only the beginning. Species that had vanished from survey records started reappearing. Fish that hadn't been documented in certain stretches of the river for decades were suddenly showing up again, native species returning to waters that had written them off. Larger fish, the ones that had been hit hardest by industrial trawling, were recovering fastest of all, growing bigger and healthier than anything recorded in years. Then came the news about the porpoises. The Yangtze Finless porpoise, the smiling, critically endangered mammal that scientists had been watching slide toward extinction for decades, did something it had never done in the entire history of modern monitoring. Its population went up from 1,012 individuals in 2017 to 1,249 in 2022, and then to 1,426 by 2025. You heard that right after decades of freefall, the only freshwater porpoise on the planet started coming back. It was spotted in stretches of the river where it hadn't been seen in years. Researchers called the rebound extremely rare because once freshwater cetacean populations start declining, they almost never recover. And then came the most devastating revelation of all. Devastating not because it was tragic, but because of what it proved. In April of 2025, researchers released 20 adult Yangtze sturgeons, a species that had been declared extinct in the wild just 3 years earlier, into the Yangtze River, a tributary where 300 dams had been demolished. They watched through underwater cameras and sonar. Days passed, and then it happened. The sturgeons began to spawn, naturally, in open water. For the first time in over 25 years, a species the world had given up on laid its eggs in a wild river, and those eggs hatched. Tiny, translucent larvae, no bigger than a grain of rice, wriggling to life in a river that humans had spent decades destroying. The scientific community didn't use words like interesting or promising. The researchers who published the findings used words like unprecedented. One co-author, a fisheries professor from Carleton University, said he was always impressed by the resilience of nature when given space and time to recover, but admitted that nothing like this had ever been documented on a river this large. Every model said decades. The Yangtze did it in 5 years. And what that means is bigger than any single river. The miracle of absence. Here's what the Yangtze just proved, and it's something most people have never been told. Nature doesn't need humanity to save it. It needs humanity to stop destroying it. That's not the same thing, and the difference between those two ideas might be the most important distinction in the entire history of conservation. Think about what actually healed this river. It wasn't a breakthrough technology. It wasn't a genetically engineered superfish. It wasn't some billion-dollar piece of infrastructure designed to filter toxins or simulate spawning conditions. The single most powerful thing China did was remove the thing that was killing the Yangtze: human interference. They pulled the nets. They demolished the dams. They shut down the factories. They cleared the boats. And then they did the hardest thing of all, for any government, any industry, any civilization to do. They stepped back and did nothing. And the river, a system that had been in continuous decline for 70 years, a system that scientists said may have crossed the point of no return, responded in 5, not 50, 5. Fish biomass didn't just recover, it tripled. Species that had vanished came back. A porpoise that was sliding toward extinction reversed course. A sturgeon that the world had officially declared extinct in the wild started breeding again in a river it was never supposed to see. The Yangtze didn't need a miracle. It needed an absence, the absence of the thing that was killing it. And that should shake you, because if that's true for the Yangtze, and the data now says it is, then it's true for every degraded ecosystem on Earth, every overfished ocean, every clear-cut forest, every bleached coral reef, every dammed river and poisoned wetland. They are not waiting for human genius to save them. They are waiting for human destruction to stop. The science now tells us that the natural world carries within it a capacity for self-repair so powerful that when you remove the pressure, recovery doesn't just happen. The question was never whether nature could heal. It was always whether we'd let it. But that raises a second question, one that's even harder to answer. If the solution is this simple, why hasn't every country on Earth already done it? The only tool that mattered. The answer is political will. That's it. That's the entire lesson. Every nation on Earth has the science. Every government has been briefed. The data on ecological collapse in rivers, in oceans, in forests, in atmosphere has been sitting on the desks of world leaders for decades. The researchers have done their part. The models have been built. The warnings have been published. The solutions in almost every case are known. What's missing, what has always been missing, is the willingness to act on them at scale, even when it's expensive, even when it's disruptive, and even when it costs you something politically. That's what makes the Yangtze story so uncomfortable for the rest of the world. Because China didn't discover some secret formula. They didn't unlock a technology nobody else has access to. They used the single most powerful tool available to any government on Earth, the will to simply stop. To look at an industry generating billions and say, this ends now. To look at 250,000 workers and say, we will pay to retrain you, but you cannot go back to the water. To look at 300 dams and say, tear them down. To look at 9,000 chemical plants and say, shut it down or get out. That's not science. That's not engineering. That's a political decision, the kind of decision that most democracies, most economies, and most leaders are terrified to make because the cost is immediate and the reward is invisible for years. China proved the reward isn't invisible. It proved the reward comes faster than anyone believed. It proved that nature doesn't need decades to forgive us. It just needs us to stop. And now the question this story leaves behind isn't scientific. It's personal. It's political. It's the question every government, every voter, every person alive today needs to answer. If one country can do this for one river and get these results in 5 years, what is everybody else's excuse? The river remembers. If you stood on the banks of the Yangtze today, you wouldn't recognize it from the river described at the start of this story. The water is the same water. The banks are the same banks. The current still runs nearly 4,000 miles from the glaciers of Tibet to the East China Sea, but the silence is gone. Porpoises surface in stretches of the river where nobody had seen them in a generation. They're permanent. Knowing smiles, breaking the waterline, like a quiet celebration that no one organized, but everyone needed. Fish swarm in numbers that elderly villagers say they haven't witnessed since childhood, so thick in places that the water itself seems to shift and pulse with a rhythm it forgot it had. And, somewhere in the restored tributaries of the upper Yangtze, in a river where 300 dams were torn from the earth, a tiny, translucent sturgeon larva, no bigger than a grain of rice, wriggles free from its egg casing, the first of its kind to be born in open water in over 25 years. A species the world declared dead, breathing again. None of this was supposed to happen this fast. The models said generations, the skeptics said never, and the river said, watch me. You started this story with a question. What happened when China released millions of fish into a dying river? Now you know. The river came back, faster than anyone predicted, more completely than anyone imagined. Not because of what was put in, but because of what was finally taken out. And maybe that's the thing that stays with you long after this story ends. The most powerful thing humanity ever did for the Yangtze wasn't an act of creation. It was an act of surrender. They stopped, and the river remembered what it was.